Mobility as a Service in the Global South and Sustainable Mobility is a two-part webinar organized by Trufi Association that was held on March 7th and 14th, 2022. Trufi Association is an NGO that helps make public transport, active transport, and sustainable transport easier and more attractive in the Global South. We develop apps for public transport users and open data for NGOs, urban planners, and transport operators. And we work with OpenStreetMap communities to do public transport mapping. We started in Cochabamba, Bolivia, and we are now an international NGO with applications and projects in Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America. These presentations are delivered by two experts in Mobility as a Service, or MaaS, and Sustainable Mobility, Dr. Marc Hasselwander and Dr. Eric Bruun. The first presentation is by Dr. Hasselwander. Marc Hasselwander is a researcher at the German Aerospace Center and MIT Portugal, with a PhD from MIT Portugal. He previously was a visiting researcher at the University of Philippines conducting field study on MaaS demand. He is the author of multiple papers on MaaS, sustainable transport, and civic engagement, including a recent case study on digital civic engagement, which looked at the open data and open source software developed by Trufi volunteers. He has expertise in analyzing mobility behavior, MaaS systems, and platform internationalization. And he specializes in developing megacities with a focus on policy implications and accessibility gains.
Thank you very much, Pauline, for the introduction. Yes, you have said mobility as a service is a topic that I have been working on in the past years. In fact, it was the topic of my dissertation. So it's really something that I have been working on for more than 5 years. And therefore, yes, I'm very happy for the invitation today. Thanks a lot. And everyone who's joining in, thank you for your interest in this topic. And today I'm going to present, as Pauline has mentioned, some results from my research. I want to start with a brief background. I am sure that most of you are very familiar with transportation in the Global South. I looked through the participant lists, and I think many of you can even be considered as experts in this field. Therefore, I want to keep it very brief. Because what we can observe in the Global South right now is an increasing demand for transportation. And this is literally fueled by both economic and population growth. We have a very rapid urbanization in the Global South, and very characteristic are these megacities, so cities with 10 million or more inhabitants that we have both in Latin America, Africa, also in South Asia, Southeast Asia. At the same time, there's a lack of mass transport infrastructure, and in particular, rail infrastructure. And people can and do afford more private cars. And overall, this is resulting in transportation problems in cities such as Metro Manila, which you can see here pictured on the right-hand side, but also in many other developing cities. So this comes with all these negative, or maybe still back, all these negative externalities, such as noise and air pollution, traffic accidents, and overall it is resulting in declining mobility and accessibility, and especially for the poor. Now, potential solution, if we go to the next slide, that has attracted my attention when I started my PhD, which was in 2017, is mobility as a service. So the topic for today's webinar, or short, MaaS. So the idea of MaaS is to integrate different transport services by different transport service providers So usually we will have public transport as a backbone, but also all these new mobility services, including, for example, bike sharing, carpooling, ride-hailing, etc. Then the idea is also to have seamless mobility. So there should always be some kind of ticket and tariff integration. And then these services should be accessible on demand and through a single platform. So we're talking here about a mobile app, the MaaS app. And what we also have are these mobility packages. So we have a bundle of mobility services that the MaaS user can purchase, which includes a limited or unlimited number of mobility services. Okay, and yeah, what is maybe also very important here to say is that it is a concept that emerged in Europe, in Finland in particular, and most of the MaaS applications are live in the global north, as you can see here in the map. It's a bit outdated, but it still holds true. It's mostly a concept in the global north, and so my research was really focusing on, is this a concept that can address transport problems in the global south? So, as mentioned, I want to present some findings from research paper. Here one was really looking at the demand side. So we were interested in would people in Metro Manila, which was the case study, be interested in using mobility as a service? And if that's the case, we would like to find out for what reasons and how could MaaS add value to these people. As mentioned, we did this study in Manila during a research visit at UP and CTS. And we conducted an online survey. And regarding the analysis, I don't want to bother you with any mathematical expressions and equations, therefore just very briefly mentioning that the analysis was framed in utility theory, and we used discrete choice analysis, as well as some cross-validation, and then we developed, based on these analysis, policy recommendations. As a result, we obtained two econometric models, statistical models. So the first model was really to investigate the interest in MaaS, the overall interest, and we really found that the vast majority was really interested in this concept, and they stated that they would use MaaS if it would be available, 84%. And then in the second part, we also looked at those that said they would be interested in using MaaS. And we asked, if it would be available, how would it change their mobility behavior? And in particular, would they be willing to use more public transport in a MaaS system if it would be available? And now on the next slide, I translated a bit the results of these models in easier words and more comprehensible words. So for the first model, what we found that statistically, those people that are living within the city, opposed to those that live in the adjoining provinces, are more likely to use MaaS. We also found that rather people that travel on short distances are interested in MaaS, as well as users of ride-hailing services. So this was a interesting finding because it tells us that people that use mobility apps and that know how to plan, book, and pay trips online are already more interested in also using MaaS. And we should also see this as an opportunity, because these are people that could be introduced to use public transport more often. And another interesting finding, but maybe not very surprising finding, is that females are more interested in using MaaS. And if you look in the literature, this is something that you can also see for other modes, including public transport, but also bicycle sharing, etc. And this is simply due to the fact that males overall are more avid car drivers. So regarding the motivations, what we learned from these models, and maybe you can go back again, exactly, is that these people seek for travel information, finding alternative routes, for example, and for the overall reason to use MaaS, in particular, to have more reliability and to cut the current mobility spending. So they really want to save money with MaaS. Then for the second model, remember this was the question if people would use public transport more often in the MaaS scheme. We found that in this case, it's rather the people that live outside the city, that live in adjoining provinces. And this points a bit already to the fact that in these areas, we have a suppressed demand, a latent demand for public transport. And with MaaS, there would be the opportunity to integrate first and last mile solutions to solve really this problem of lacking public transport. Again, we also see that these people that would use public transport more often are people that have many mobility apps already installed on their phone. So this is really an opportunity to consolidate all the different services into one app and really introduce these people to also use public transport and use their phone to pay and plan it. Again, we also have females, again, in this case, that are more interested in using more public transport. And for the motivation, we have, again, these cost savings. But also, they want to facilitate reoccurring trips. And consider that under MaaS, this is really something that can make it much easier to do these everyday trips. Because right now in Manila, but also in many other cities, what you have to do is you pay for every trip, cash. So if you have 3 journeys, you have to pay 3 times. And under MaaS, this would be much easier. You would only pay on your phone. You would have the ticket on your phone, and this would make it much easier for commuters. Now going to the next slide to maybe sum up the findings from this study and comparing it to the existing literature, where we have to say that most of the existing studies are really in global north context, and especially in Finland, Sweden, or the Netherlands. And if you are a public authority or a transport planner that wants to introduce MaaS, what you really have to understand is that there are really different motivations for users to use MaaS. Unlike in the global north, it would probably not be environmental awareness, so this was not any significant in our study, but it is rather economic and practical concerns. And as mentioned, a consolidation of different transport service into a single app. This is something that the people really expect and want. And then finally, we also found that, and this is also very opposed to what has been described in the literature, it is really in the Global South a solution for all age groups. And in existing studies, all of these studies, they found that younger people are more interested. And in Manila, and I think it's the same in many other developing cities, it was even for the elderly. Another study that we conducted, we looked at the point of view of transport authorities and possible implementation barriers for MaaS. And if you go to the next slide, I just want to very briefly mention here, because this is actually something that the next speaker, Bruun, is going to talk about, what are potential barriers. And here we used the TOE framework and found that it is in particular technology barriers that can hinder MaaS. This, I would say, is not very surprising, considering that MaaS is really a data-driven approach. But for the Global South context, what we found is really that the integration of informal transport is a barrier. Or as we learned in one of the previous Trufi webinars, we should actually call it popular transport. And these, of course, are everywhere in the Global South and are characterized by a very fragmented operator landscape. So this is really a barrier for implementing MaaS. But as mentioned, Bruun is going to talk a bit more about this topic. And I want to present the results of one more study, and this is also the third and last that I'm going to talk about today. And here we really wanted to quantify potential benefits of MaaS and also integrated transport. What we did for this purpose is we wanted to calculate accessibility gains. So how can accessibility improve if we have a MaaS system? And for this purpose, we use 3 different data sources that are all open data sources. So first is satellite imagery. So this is data that is available for every city in the world. Second, we use OpenStreetMap data for the household location, for the road network. The household location was from satellite imagery, and the OSM data is available for at least almost all cities worldwide. And then the third thing that we need for this study is our GTFS data. And these are data that contain information about public transit, where are the stops located, schedules, etc. This is something where Trufi is really an expert in. And these data sets are available, I would say, for many cities in the Global South. And if they are not available, I recommend you to talk to the guys from Trufi, because they know how to make these data available. And then relying on these 3 data sets, what we did for the calculation of accessibilities is we really relied on the definition by United Nations Habitat, which is simply defined as the population with access to a public transport stop within 500-meter walking distance, divided to by the total number of inhabitants. Then what we considered for the study is that access to public transport for the first or last mile can not only be by walking, but it could also be combined with, for example, micromobility, shared e-scooters or shared bicycles. So we did some simulation and increased the distance to, for example, 2,000 meters for scooters or 3,000 meters for bicycles, and then have these different scenarios that you can see on the next slide. And on the right-hand side, you can see here an accessibility index. And the orange line indicates the status quo. Right now, the people that have access to transport, public transport within these certain distances. You can see at 500 meters, if you integrate informal transport, so we're talking here about all these, popular transport, we're talking here about all these minibuses or 2 or 3 wheelers, the accessibility or people that can access public transport already increases 3 times. And on the right-hand side, what is also visualized is where are these areas that usually have or that usually are lacking access to public transport. And you can see it's really in the periphery. And these are therefore really the areas where, for example, shared micromobility can provide a remedy, and where electric or shared e-scooters and shared bicycles can really help people to access public transport stops. Now, going to the next slide, already coming to the end of my presentation, just to sum up. So transport integration really helps addressing latent demand, especially in the periphery. It facilitates multimodal trips, and for the policy recommendations, what we conclude in this study is that the public sector should really anticipate MaaS and actively support transport integration through soft and hard measures, and plan and stimulate the use of micromobility. Now, as mentioned, I want to refer you to my publications together with several co-authors, where you can really read further on what I have just presented. You can reach out to me if you don't have access to these papers, and I'm happy to share them with you. And I hope I have delivered in time. And that's it so far from my side. And I think I can therefore give back to you, Pauline.
The next presentation is by Dr. Eric Bruun. Dr. Bruun is a transportation systems analyst and the author of 2 books on public transport systems and sustainable transport, including Sustainable Infrastructure Investment, which was published last year. He studied informal transport in sub-Saharan Africa with faculty from the University of Cape Town. He has been a visiting professor and adjunct faculty at universities in Finland and in the U.S. Dr. Bruun has managed multiple national and international transport consulting projects. He holds bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees in mechanical and systems engineering.
Okay, so thank you. And I would like to add one thing about my background. I was previously, until recently, working with Kuti, a company in Helsinki that makes mobility as a service software. Although I have to add that we had never responded to a request for proposals in the developing country. You know, they were almost exclusively in Europe and North America. Okay. So it's a little bit pertinent background. And then I also want to add that some of this information might seem dated from research it did together with people at University of Cape Town, University in Nairobi, and a university in Dar es Salaam, but it's really not. The institutional issues I'm going to present are still largely pertinent today. There have been some breakthroughs in a few places, but we can address the pertinence of them at the questions and answers. And I'd gladly like to hear if you know of some current news. Okay, so here's some common features of informal public transport. And okay, direct service networks. We don't see too many systems based on passenger transfer between different modes. And they tend to be small fleet owners. And however, they're not necessarily directly owned. That's fairly rare. Usually they're not owner drivers, but these tend to be situations where a different company or individual owns vehicles and you pay by the day it operated, and you keep the pay you earn afterwards, that revenues you earn, and you maybe have to pay for your own fuel. There tends to also be a lot of route associations or cooperatives, which means that even if it looks to an outsider like there aren't routes, there actually are routes often. And in a place like South Africa, you operate in some other cooperatives or route associations areas at your peril. Okay, so there's like an unspoken law often of where you are allowed to operate. But you also, the good side is you can cover an area 24/7 by people taking turns operating at night or during the daytime. So there are a lot of advantages to the user from that. Okay, and you'll often see fill and go systems where there's a rank or stage where the vehicles line up, and as soon as the vehicle is full, then it moves on, and the next one going along this particular route, then I use the word route loosely sometimes, then it fills, and there's quite a few cases where you overfill. Okay, now cash fare collection mostly, but we see increasingly, and Trufi knows more about this and more current than me, there are a lot of pay methods using smartphones and pay cards and others, so people do not have to carry cash. Okay, but their functionality may be limited, certainly not at the category of MaaS. Okay, and then there's a target system. Well, what's meant by target system? That goes back to small fleet owners. Okay, they have a vehicle they're allowed to use, and they need to aim to carry a certain number of passengers and collect a certain number of fares, or they won't have enough money left over at the end of the day after paying for the usage fee and paying for the fuel and all that to pay for food for their family. Okay, next slide. And Ted, okay, there we go. Now, here's some very key problems. So when you have unrestricted market entry, often meaning the government regulating the entry as opposed to associations, you get over trading on more lucrative routes. That means too many vehicles vying for passengers. And they compete aggressively often, which is dangerous, right? They'll zoom ahead of each other. And this target system incentivizes drivers to compete in the market for passengers. Okay, and so some examples of speeding, signal jumping, then unsafe stopping. And now, like that bottom right corner, that's the main highway into Nairobi. That is actually the motorway. And it's really hard to keep on schedule on a fixed route when you have road conditions like this. And I'll add one little anecdote. There is a animal refuge on the side, and there have been cases when lions have gotten out and sit on the freeway. Could you imagine being on a moped or there's a lion in the road? Okay, so this is all the kind of things that vary locally. You get these kind of things where when you get like wildlife running, you're not going to see too many motorcycles in the mix of modes. Okay, and we don't have time to go into all the details, but the vehicles are not the same in every city, as we all know, and they have distinctive names often, like tuk-tuks, right? Okay, so here's some more key problems. All right, now, labor conditions can be very bad, and this follows from the target system, right? If they're trying to struggle to make enough money, there's often going to be problems, especially if they're very broke. Okay, and now the vehicle assets are often poorly maintained. And again, if the owner is not plowing back the money they charge to the drivers, the vehicles will tend to deteriorate massively. And the last thing these cities need is heavy air pollution from poorly tuned engines and brake linings that are worn and a lot of other problems. Okay, and we already said this in a different way below. Poor business viability results in overloading on more lucrative routes, which of course compounded with the worn brakes and with bad engines and all that. That's obviously worn tires. That's obviously a recipe for very serious accidents. So next. Okay, now here's a few my friends took. Looking along the motorway. Actually, these vehicles are going 100 kilometers an hour, and here's the van stopping in the road and actually a little bit in the driving lane. And another one in Addis Ababa. Look at how he's parked there, and you see the next wave, platoon of cars. It's going to have to go around that choke point. And I took this one in the middle. I was kind of flabbergasted. We were driving down the road in Johannesburg, and this truck, he just stops in the lane. He doesn't even clear the intersection. He just stops and takes the people right there. So, okay, and this is not obviously helping move the vehicles either, because the drivers are in some sense their own worst enemies when they do this. Okay, now this is Dar es Salaam they did build a rail line recently, and I haven't seen what it looks like, but I imagine this still goes on. Now look at this road, the way the vehicles are lined up along there. How are you going to keep the traffic flowing through something like this? And the question is, who is going to enforce the regulations? Okay, now, remember I mentioned at the beginning that we don't see intermodal transfers, which is very much the modern way used in highly developed systems with integrated fares. Years ago, when we did this class on rail transit planning, one of the student projects would be to go out and count how many people move between the minivans and the Cape Town suburban trains, as they call them, at the rush hour. And so we sat there, and it was a grand total of 1%. So in other words, they're just co-located, but they don't have any kind of real even interest in transferring between them. Why would they? Because the users don't want to do it because they have to pay 2 full fares, and the drivers don't want to do it, or the people who own the vehicles the drivers use don't want to do it because they don't see any revenue advantage from doing it, right? And this is where like mobility as a service could be of great value. Okay. Now, it's not all negative, though. For these paratransit operations, there are other ways. Despite often low formal educations, they're not stupid, and they figure out opportunities. And then, like this first bullet pointed, they sometimes respond to changes they see. If they see some new demand, some new place opens, a new employment center, or something has changed, or the roads have been cleared that used to be blocked, they respond quickly. Okay, and it's amazing what they can do, often free of subsidization. Now, there's partial subsidization in places too. Like South Africa had a big program shortly after ANC came in to do what's called the recapitalization. And the first thing they were going to do was help people buy newer vehicles, both that they were bigger so they could carry more passengers and to get the safety standards up. Okay, but generally, they have very little operating subsidy. Okay, now paratransit's an important source of income, and this is a good place often for people to go who aren't in the formal economy, who don't have their 9-to-5 jobs or night shift jobs steady somewhere. The barriers to entry can be quite low, especially if you're friends with somebody in a cooperative of some kind. Okay, now these small vehicles too, they have their advantage against larger buses. You say, well, why don't they run larger buses? Well, it isn't just the cost of buying them and operating them and the increased likelihood that the government will come down on you for bad driving. These vehicles actually can maneuver in bad traffic conditions when the large buses get stuck. Okay, so all things considered, you don't see that much migration, and the large buses you do see tend to be in the formal sector. Okay, now, hybridity is the thing that we researched. I did not invent the term. I was lucky enough to be let into this project since I was teaching a course. I would not have used the term because in the north, this tends to mean hybrid buses are like diesel electric or compressed natural gas electric, meaning they have a hybrid propulsion system. That's not what's meant here. What's meant here is you can get 2 services that peacefully coexist. They charge a little bit different fares and they offer different levels of service. That's one possible solution we can look at. Integrated service, which more follows the northern model, where you have trunk feeder services. Now that, if you recall what I showed you from Claremont in the Cape Town suburbs, there was only a 1% transfer rate. But there's no reason why, when you have those kind of facilities, that with the proper pricing and proper service alterations, you couldn't maybe give a combined fare that's better for both the passengers and the operator. Okay, but now path dependency and constraints. Path dependencies, that's a very academic term. It just means you can't do things that don't take into account everything that's gone before, and that there's inertia to a system. Okay, so business owners themselves can be a big part of the problem. There have been cases where the police own some of the vehicles that the owner operators. You can imagine the mischief that would cause, right? When the police, because they can crack down on other companies' vehicles and not their own, which of course will anger the other place. And so this is part of the reason for South Africa's reputation for violence in the past. Okay, now the institutional capacity to design these systems is often lacking. Like the University of Cape Town is a very prestigious university in Africa and has an engineering school, and they don't really have that many courses for people who want to be public transport experts. And like I was teaching a rail planning course, another fellow from the United States was teaching a bus planning course, but there should be very serious large array of course offerings at all major universities to bring up the institutional capability both within the government and the consulting companies who advise cities, within the cities themselves have to enforce it, and within the operating companies. Okay, and we needed to work on that, and there are some attempts at that which we could talk about in the Q&A if you want. And then if you don't get sufficient success in early phases, this undermines support and you have a hard time moving farther. So you have to try to pick things that are the low-hanging fruit, to use that cliche, right? To show people that you're serious and that there could be some benefit. All right, next slide. Okay, integration, easier said than done. Okay, so formal services give reliable time connections, of course. Now, informal services often withdraw service or wait for full vehicles. There's actually something in between which you could go into if you wanted, like the Curitiba, not Curitiba, the Transmilenio in Bogota. It turned out it may look formal, but it ran in kind of an informal way where every time the buses started to become uncrowded, they would withdraw some from service. That's one way to keep the revenues up, right? Okay, but it's not a way to attract choice passengers. So there is a little bit of gray area about what constitutes a formal and informal, but for our purposes, the informal ones are what I described in the last few pages largely, okay? And the railway, which I haven't really discussed, like the suburban case in the large suburban network in Cape Town, that's a formal service by a government-owned corporation. Okay, now these formal operators are a threat to informal's livelihood, because if you look at how they operate often, they're competing. Like Cape Town actually has a big downtown. It's a big employment center. I was trying to explain to people that it's got the same amount of employment as downtown San Francisco. It's not a small city. So there is enough demand that even the railways by themselves, despite the huge trains, there's still demand that these smaller vehicles can carry, even if not necessarily the most safest way or comfortable way. Okay, so now the mechanisms don't really exist yet often to manage a reduction in these informal operators. And how can you do this anyway unless, how can you make requests or pressure to take them off the road when the trains are overcrowded? You know, you've got to spend some money on providing alternatives before you try to ban people. They resent it, okay? So the other thing that ends up happening with integration, when you try to do it, you get these informal operators that don't really want to be involved. They try to keep out of sight and out of mind. Why? Because they're avoiding corruption and harassment. For example, people who own other vehicles, they may be trying to get yours singled out for being removed from the road because they have unsafe features, they're too worn. So you just try to hide out and do your job quietly. And then there's pressure to achieve financially unrealistic standards. So they're very busy often dealing with that. And they don't really have time to spend in nice chat sessions, you know, and how are we going to organize this cooperative better? It's hard to find the time to do this. Now, transparency on fares collected too. You don't really want transparency. You don't want an open system where there's a record of where the money went necessarily, right? Because if you have that kind of environment, then you can see who's kind of cheating who, or and anyway, the point is kind of clear that for something like mobility as a service, this ability to either make fares transparent or not transparent to certain selected groups or individuals is an important issue. Okay, so it's very complicated. Transparency, even in a rich country like Finland, is not as strong as you might think, because there are issues like privacy to maintain. People don't want a perfect record of everywhere they ever traveled with their fare collection system necessarily. Okay, so that's a complicated problem. Okay, next slide. Now, the legacy of distrust. We already talked about this before in different ways: corrupt enforcement, broken promises. Or you put in mandatory technology and it doesn't work as promised. That undermines future requests. And people don't want to invest in transient technologies that might be replaced. So you don't want anything really expensive and complicated, multi-year commitment if you know it's just going to be obsolete. And then the use of monitoring technologies for criminal sanctions, that may sound like a good idea, but on the other hand, when you come in and make that demand, then you can't get the other requests honored that you're going to make, because all they're thinking about is that they're going to now be monitored closely, and so they're just going to resist to participate. Okay, and surrender planning authority. Forecasting and route selection. Now, how do we do modeling on these kind of things? Well, we're going to see an example in a second. There is something you can do even without the fancy intelligent transportation system technology that formal agencies equip their routes and their vehicles with. Okay, and capacity planning. That's a very important issue too, which again may not be done by the people with the best skills to do that. Okay, and service reliability investments, those need to be picked carefully. Who's going to pay for those? Okay, and what's the low-hanging fruit? And then revenues, you know what a gross contract model is? For those who don't, it just means the gross contract model means you just hold on to everything and then distribute it, disperse it to all the players, like the vehicle owner and to yourself. A net contract model means you are paid to operate the vehicle and somebody else collects the revenues and distributes those. So those are two distinctly different contracts. Okay, now the owner versus driver conflict will still exist if the driver's not switched to a salary. Okay, so even with the gross contract, you can see that it's not so easy to settle these things, because how do we know that the driver isn't pocketing too much? It said this video is paused. Are you okay now? Okay, yeah, I got a message you were paused. Okay. Now, availability and use of capital investment funds. All of these things like queue bypasses and signal priority and shelters that the northern countries use can be added incrementally as government money becomes available. Even simple bus lanes by conversion could be cheap. And that's not the issue. The issue is that the wealthy people who are used to driving everywhere are also the same ones who have the political power. That's not just a Southern issue, by the way. Okay, so here was our reform program. Business development, operating environment, vehicle fleets, and operations. Those are the 4 areas. And you can read for yourself later, but they include things like business consolidation, skills training, diversification to other skills that you can sell based on your ability to operate fleets, bulk purchasing discounts, and you get better terminals with better information, better prioritization, embayments. That means, I guess that's kind of the British word for structured parking that's clearly marked as to which routes. Vehicle renewals and cooperative loans. Driver training, very important. Salary drivers is very, very helpful, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and ICT, that could be called Intelligent Transportation Systems as well. And this could be on both the consumer side and on the operator side. And that's a very good example of mobility as a service. Okay, speed governors, real-time passenger info, et cetera, cashless ticketing. All of those we've talked a little bit about in the past. So if you take the attitude, you're not out to punish the drivers, but you're out to improve the service. Here's cashless fare collection. There you can see a pay card, Beba Pay. And the speed governors are, notice that that's not necessarily punishment, that's just self-enforcing. Okay, in vehicle tracking, now you have to make a deal with people that this isn't used for legal sanctions. This is used for cooperatives to better manage their operations. Redistribution of existing subsidies, like why should these fixed route operators, some of them are private companies and they're formal, but why do they get so much money and why do those people have luxurious, never crowded buses and the poorer people have to face overcrowding? So why not redistribute some of that money? Okay, now diversification of purchase of assets. Some of these cooperatives have found that they're really good at tourist trips. They can take people to the mountains in like Kenya, right, or Tanzania, or South Africa. God knows there are lots of wildlife parks. And loyalty programs. Okay, in Kenya they call these cooperatives SACCOs. These things can do bulk purchase deals. Okay, like with a person who's good at negotiating does this as their full-time job, and you buy all your tires or all your petrol from particular companies in exchange for lower prices. A couple more. Security of income. Automatic fare collection is a very good thing if possible, which means you go through a turnstile or something, which means that you don't have to worry about that issue. Is the driver or is the owner operator pocketing too much money? All right, you know exactly how much money the passengers use to ride on those vehicles. Okay, and whether a smart card or one of these fare payment cards works that way depends on the rules of the smart card, what level of transparency there is, as I already mentioned. Okay, advertising, that's done in the north a lot. That's already widespread. And here you can see an example. Okay, let's move on finally, do a little bit about background on what kind of data would be needed and helpful in order to set up a MaaS in this kind of environment. It's partly these institutions, as I mentioned, and you can see they could be formidable, but in order to make something like a mobility as a service work, you need to have some information about travel times on links and networks, and you need to have other useful information for forecasting whether you're going to make meets or not, especially if you have a hybrid service where you're trying to get a small vehicle to meet the railway. And you can't plan these kind of things unless A, the service is extremely frequent, which it can be in the daytime, but not in the evenings. You either have to have real-time information so that the MaaS app can show that, or you have to have some pretty good statistics. And like say 80% of the time you'd make some meets. So look what happened with MIT a few years back for the Nairobi bus rapid transit study. they found out there's actually some roots there. It's just that only their regular users know about it, and they managed to get some good data. So this is very doable nowadays, and you can even compensate drivers for carrying temporary equipment. Okay, next. And we all know all this mobile phone functions. This is my one partner who happened to be from that part of Africa, who worked at Alto University. They've successfully using smartphones in a variety of applications. They have not done it in transportation. Right. But you can see, we don't need to spend too much time on this. You primarily know what phone functions there are nowadays. Okay, next. Okay, so here you can see somebody is walking, and you can see the duration they're walking. And you can see that by their vibration signatures that they make. Okay, now e-diaries are what we call phones that are set up to monitor. And you can even put in comments during the day, or you can be prompted to put in a comment. What are you doing at the moment? Okay, this is a way we build up both information about where people want to go, at what times of the day, what modes are using, but we're also providing the information needed to build hybrid structures where we connect informal to formal routes. Okay, next. Okay, smartphones, they're everywhere now, and apparently you can buy €100 or €200 knockoff phones for phones that used to be €1,000 5 years ago. So they're fast getting down into the realm where even in the poorer countries, they're increasingly widespread, although it does remain a big issue, of course, for people who don't have a smartphone. And like Ted and I were talking about yesterday, maybe there's some shortcuts there too, where you could get mobility as a service types of information, but on freer platforms like Facebook Messenger. Okay, we don't have time to go into that, and I'm a little out of date on those things. Okay, so if you want to look at this, there's low-end non-smartphones. We certainly can use them partially. They're not going to provide the rich information we saw of Nairobi about travel time. They're not going to have fast internet connectivity, but they could give some rudimentary service, and some smart people can find ways to extract more benefit. So here's a few conclusions. There's definitely things one can do right away. There's no excuse to not do anything, and I mean that at the governmental level especially. Now, some of the people at the operational level, they have such tough lives often, or work such long hours, that who could blame them if they're not leading the way and they're cooperative. MaaS is definitely the next advancement in the use of smartphones, and it has come a long way. And it really does make sense from a variety of standpoints to try to use MaaS if we can overcome the cost of buying these smartphones with this capability, and if we can overcome the cost of being connected when you need to get the information you need. It does make a lot of sense. And okay, the effectiveness of entrepreneurial and organizational solutions. There is no substitute for capital investments. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Gabriel Roth. He was a World Bank person for years, and he had a fanatical viewpoint that you could sell transportation just like you sold carrots in the farmer's market. Well, that's ridiculous, because you get the vehicles caught in mixed traffic. And their own theory shows that, neoclassical theory shows you've got to separate out higher performance modes. Otherwise, they will not remain as higher performance. Everything will degrade back to the kind of horrible traffic jams we see. Okay, so mobility as service continues to be useful, and it can be more useful, but as I hope this presentation made clear, you really, really have to get some institutional changes first and set the stage, so to speak. Okay, so one last little comment at the bottom. You can go to the ASEC website at the University of Cape Town. There's multiple research papers about South Africa, Kenya, and Tanzania there if you want to read more. Okay, thanks.
We thank Drs. Hasselwander and Bruun for their time and for sharing their expertise. To be notified of future events and webinars, subscribe to our newsletter or follow any of our social media channels. The links are in the footer of every page on our website. Thank you for watching.